What would happen if you hired a game developer and simply told them, make me a game to speedrun? Well, that's just what we're gonna find out today. But first comes first, I had to actually find someone to do this stupid idea for me. So I went on Fiverr, the place where you can purchase pretty much any service. Right away, there wasn't exactly what I needed. While there were a lot of people advertising for really cheap mobile games, I wanted something that would actually be pretty fun to speedrun, so I upped my price range. Now, game development is expensive, especially when making something from scratch. There are assets, programming, art, UI, and a whole lot more, so I was surprised about how relatively cheap some of these options were. And after a bit of looking around, I found the perfect guy for the job, Umair. Looking at Umair's profile, it was exactly what I needed. A cool game that would probably be pretty fun to play while not completely breaking my budget. So I messaged Umair about my plans. I was looking for someone to take complete creative control over the game, with the only requirement being it would be fun to speedrun and that it would take about 3 to 10 minutes to complete. I wanted absolutely no say in what type of game it was or how it was developed. This would be a complete surprise. But obviously, that's kind of a weird request and probably one that Umair doesn't get very often. To be fair, speedrunning is still pretty niche, so we wanted a bit more details to go off of. Fair enough. I told him that I still wanted almost everything to be a surprise, but there's always the safe bet of doing a platformer. I was thinking something like Carlson.
It's just a little game I'm working on, wishlist on Steam.
Celeste, Cluster Truck. There are a lot of ways to make a cool speedrun with this type of game. And then a bit later, he came back with this. Fartman. It's a Flappy Bird type game, which to be fair doesn't look too bad, but in my opinion it wouldn't really be good for speedrunning. Umair told me that he could build off of that game and add more stuff to it, but yeah, we went in another direction. Finally though, after a bit more talking, he found an old project that would work a lot better. He described it as a Dark Souls-like game, and since Dark Souls speedruns are sick, I agreed that he should do that. Also, since a lot of the assets were already completed, it would only take about a month to finish. So after that, it was just a waiting game for me, which means I had plenty of time to ask you to subscribe if you enjoy the content.
More like belongs in the trash!
But anyways, after an entire month, Umair completed the game. At this point, other than a few screenshots he gave me showing the environment he made before, I had seen and played none of the game. And this was the final product, Aegon the Beginning. I don't know if I said that right. Now, before I could get to actually speedrunning the game, I had to play it. So I booted up my Twitch stream and tested it out. First of all, the environment of the game is really cool. The area and enemies all look good, and I love the setting that Umair went with. While a lot of the enemies are just copy and pasted, and that led to a few problems we'll get to later, I had no major complaints. Secondly, we have way more moves than I expected. In total, we have 2 regular sword attacks and 3 special attacks. For the sword attacks, we have a regular and strong attack, with the strong attack having more of a cooldown and longer animation. Then the special attacks are this fire shot thingy, a green kick attack, and this thing where we slam the ground with our sword. Finally, our character can also drink potions that they pick up as they go through the map. Now for the story of the game, there is none. Yeah, I don't really know what you were expecting, but the objective is pretty simple. We want to go through the map and beat up enemies. Eventually, we reach a point where we can't continue and have to defeat certain enemies to get a key and open a new area, which leads us into the game's problems. But before we get to those, I want to say this clearly. For the price and time limit of the game, it turned out amazing. I have nothing but praise for what Umair was able to make, but there are problems with the game, so I'm going to go over them. My problem with the key mechanic is there was no way of telling that we needed to do this other than some text on the menu screen. For the first little bit of playing the game, I was really confused on how to progress, and it could have been made a bit better if this was more clear. Along with this, there isn't really any indication of which enemies we needed to defeat to get the keys. On your first playthrough, you kind of just have to defeat every enemy, hoping that one will unlock the doors, and then after a bit, the enemies start following you around and become a big group that you have to slowly take out. That also leads us into how the fighting works. The fighting is kind of weird. When you're fighting multiple enemies at the same time, you can only damage one of them with each attack. Even if I used an ability that seemed big enough to damage the group, it would just hit one of them and ignore the rest. You also can't focus on a specific target because it feels like it randomly chooses which one to damage. Now for the enemies themselves, they hurt a lot. But to be fair, Umair did describe this as a Dark Souls-like game, so I wasn't expecting it to be easy. For the main enemies, you have these 3 different kinds: the small guys, the medium dudes, and the big boys. And obviously Obviously, they get stronger as they get bigger. After a bit of messing around with the game, I finally figured out that the ones we needed to defeat were always the biggest enemies in the room. The basic game plan for progression became ignoring all the small enemies and running through them until I reached a dead end, before then killing the biggest enemies until the door unlocked. Obviously, this was weird with how many enemies would try to chase after me, since I just kind of ignored them, but it was the best way to save health. This also created a problem where sometimes the enemies would corner my character and I couldn't escape at all, losing all of my health. That just meant I needed to play a bit smarter though. But speaking of health, along with the enemies doing a lot of damage, the potions that can be found on the ground don't heal you much at all. So the most effective way to play the game ended up being running up to an enemy, hitting them with a special attack, and running away until the cooldown was gone. But like I said, overall the game is still really cool, it just has a few problems. One thing that isn't a problem though is its two bosses. Once we obtain 3 different keys and make it to the end of the map, we get the boss fights, which I loved. Now the bosses weren't hard per se, because most of the difficulty from the game came from enemies swarming up to hurt you, and the bosses were one-on-one battles, but they just look super cool. The first boss is this orc creature with 2 gigantic fists. This guy is very scary when you first encounter him, and honestly I thought he would one-shot me, so I played the keep away game. He has multiple fist attacks that look crazy, but he also doesn't have too much health, so I took care of him pretty easily. Then after that, we have easily the best enemy in the game, this bird guy. People are gonna be so mad at me for these names. We defeat him in the same way as the last boss, by pretty much just running, and he has a multitude of attacks. All of them have really nice looking particle effects too, with what I would assume to be area damage. I don't know, I'm too good at this game to find out. But eventually bird guy goes down and we completed the game for the first time. Let's finally get on to some speedruns. Now just through playing the game for a total of 26 minutes and 9 seconds, I already knew how the speedrun would go. The idea behind the speedrun is pretty much the same thing you need to do for the regular game, but faster. We run past the first few enemies, ignoring everything we don't care about until we get to the first key monster. Then it's a game of trying not to lose too much health and doing our best to only damage the guy we want. Now our main sources of damage are going to be the firebolt, the kick, and the regular sword swing. The other moves just have too much end lag and don't do enough damage to justify using them anyways. But once the first key monster is dead, we run another marathon until we make it to the next 2 key enemies. To move on, we need to defeat both of them, and this one's a little bit harder because smaller enemies start grouping up and almost trap us in a corner. But after playing the game enough, I got used to it. We then get some more hallways where we run past some big guys, go up some stairs, and travel a bit more until this group of 4 key enemies that we need to defeat. Luckily for this part, these are the only enemies in the room, so it doesn't matter which one we hit. They all have to go down eventually, and they do just that. Now it's time for the bosses, which funnily enough are probably the easiest part of the speedrun. I even got hit by the first boss fight and learned that he does less damage than the regular enemies, which is kind of funny. So it's just cruising through the fights until we get our first speedrun time, 4:14. After that, I decided to grind out the run a little bit more because I was having a pretty good time. I ended up getting 2 more PBs and finished with the time of 3:54, which I'm satisfied with because, hey, that's a world record. But I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it. It really helps me with the YouTube algorithm, and I really appreciate it. Also, check out my other videos. I do a lot of speedrunning type content on this channel, so if you enjoyed this video, you might enjoy my others, and if you do, subscribe. But enough shilling. Thank you all for watching. I'll catch you next time.